Hi guys, in this video I'm going to go through an analysis of the poem London, and the first thing that we need to do is just quickly go over the context, the form of the poem, attitudes that are presented in it, and what other poems this poem could link to. So here is the basic context that you need to understand for the poem, and that is that Blake, who's the writer, is a romantic poet. And he believed that innocence in society has been lost and that the society has been corrupted. Now, the second thing we need to look at is the form of this poem. So here is the form of this poem. It is a dramatic monologue and it gives us a first-hand perspective of Blake's view. So it's his first-hand, so it's from what he's seeing from his perspective. Now, the next thing that we should know is the attitudes that are being presented in this poem. So the two main attitudes in this poem are anger and hopelessness. And these two attitudes are quite zoomed in on a lot in this poem. And the final thing we need to know is what other poems we could link it to. So here is just a short list of the other poems that we could link it to. And that is Ozymandias, War Photographer, and Checking Out My History. Now we're going to go on to the poem and we're going to start annotating. But the first thing we need to do is actually understand what is going on. So the first thing that happens, I'm just going to give you a quick summary before we annotate, is the narrator is describing a walk where everywhere he goes, people are affected by misery and despair. And this misery is relentless and is caused by the people in power. And those people do nothing to help the people who are in need. So that's just a very, very quick summary of the poem. If you want to understand the poem in detail, there is a separate video just for the summary and just for the context of this poem. So you can also watch that on my channel. So the first quote that I'm going to zoom in on is this one. Now, the reason I picked this quote is because, first of all, whenever we pick a quote, we need to know what kind of feature it is. So what language feature is it? And we know that this is repetition. And it's repetition of marks. Now, what we need to think about once we've looked at what language feature it is what can we take out from it? So what is the meaning of it? What can we highlight and signify? And the first thing that we can say for this is that it's highlighting eternal despair with no relief. So let's write that. And we can also say that, so when we think of a mark, it's like very difficult to get rid of. If it's like a stain, we can get rid of it. If it's a mark, we can't really easily get rid of it. So we can say the people are permanently branded with sorrow because there's weakness, woe, sadness, dejection, so sorrow. So they're permanently branded with sorrow. So that is the first quote that I would pick. Notice how there's a third repetition of mark here as well. So in the sentence just before. So it's just highlighting how there's despair everywhere in London as Blake is walking through it. And he feels as if the people are permanently branded with that sorrow. Now, the next point, the next quote that I would pick is this one. And this says, mind-forged manacles. Now, just to keep in mind, there are lots of other quotes that you can zoom in on, but these are the main ones that I would pick and how I would expand on them and explain them. So mind-forged manacles is a metaphor. And just before I write, I'm just going to explain what it means. When we think of something that's mind-forged, so manacles is like, it would give you connotations of being stuck, imprisoned. Manacles is like you're brainwashed. So all of these kind of things we can say that this metaphor is highlighting how the people in London are imprisoned and they've been brainwashed. So that's what I would write. And just to expand on that, manacles is like when you're stuck, you've been brainwashed, you're imprisoned, your mind has been taken over by the people in control, and you have no control over it. And this is why Blake is going against tyranny, and he's basically saying, when he's going through London, that everybody is in despair, and that is because they have no control. It's all the people in power who have been corrupted, and they're not taking care of their people, and that is what is causing all the sorrow and the dejection. Now, the next quote that I'm going to pick is here. And this quote says, "Chimney sweepers cry." So the first thing that we want to zoom in on is that it is explaining and emphasizing the corruption of innocence. So we can link this to the corruption of innocence. And it is emphasizing how the innocent children are being made to sweep the chimneys, and they're crying, and they're young children. So again, here, this is the corruption of innocence coming into the poem. How so what Blake is viewing and he's seeing, and he's protesting against it because he doesn't like it. Because all of these things are showing how the government or the people in power are not doing anything to help these people. They're actually leaving them to it, which is creating that sorrow and that kind of harsh and upset atmosphere. And you can link this to child labor as well, which is totally wrong. And also that they're young children. So we just want to write just a few points here, and you can explain this using lots and lots of different quotes. For example, every cry, infants cry, every voice, ban, fear. Over here, we can use these quotes here and use it in a semantic field of maybe oppression, you could say. But that's just to back up this quote and say the corruption of innocence is one of the key features that Blake is highlighting. And we can also see that there's lots of repetition here. So every, we've got marks. So just notice how there's so much so the emphasis of this corruption and of this oppression and this sorrow is being highlighted by constant repetition of these semantic field. So the semantic field of oppression, for example, is constantly being highlighted with the repetition of the words every and mark, things like that. So cry, infants, fear, so all of these here. Now the next thing that I'm going to zoom in on, so the next quote is actually in the next line, and that is blackening church. Now this is religious imagery, and it is highlighting and emphasizing the corruption versus the purity. So the church is supposed to be pure because it's religious. So it's supposed to be pure compared to the corruption of the people in power, so the government. However, it's tarnished because of the failure that they cannot look after the people properly. And that is this is one of the key quotes that I would take from this poem. And so if I could just write it on the side here. So, if we think about it, it's not just the monarchy, the government, the people in power who are actually creating this negative atmosphere and this relentless misery. It's actually the church as well. So the next thing that I would look at and I would highlight is in the next stanza. And that quote is here. So, youthful harlot's curse. And again, this is highlighting the corruption of innocence of the babies even, because the prostitutes are a curse on London. So that is a key quote again to highlight the corruption of the innocence, as Blake was mentioning, as he or what he is trying to express in this poem, of how the innocence of the society of the youth, of the children, has been corrupted, as well as the society itself, the leaders, the monarchy, and the church. So again, this is a further implementation of how Blake is showing the corruption of innocence in London. Now, just quickly, if we look at this contextually, Blake was inspired by the French Revolution. And there's a significant link in this poem, and that is here. The blood down the palace walls. So that is the link to the French Revolution, the working class who overthrew the monarchy. And that is a direct link to the French Revolution. And this blackening church and this imagery may potentially be a visual image of the ugliness due to the Industrial Revolution. So that's just another extra point that I'm going to write here, just for you to remember, because it has it's got like a significant meaning to it. Yeah, so that is a very key point, contextually as well. So you can add that into context. And if we go further down, I just want to look at the last line of this poem. And I want to look at the line in two separate parts. So the first part I'm going to look at I'm going to look at the blights with plagues, and I'm going to look at marriage here. So those are the two separate things, separate parts. I'm going to split it in two, and then I'm going to explain it. So the first part I'm going to look at is blights with plagues. And we want to zoom into a semantic field here. So there's a semantic field of disease and illness. Yeah? And this is kind of, we can say that it highlights how these diseases and illnesses are eternal in London. So that's the first part of this final sentence. It's a semantic field of disease and illness. And it's kind of highlighting how these diseases and illnesses are eternal in London, and they could symbolize the sorrow, the oppression, and all of that kind of stuff that the monarchy and the church they're doing it to the people. They're making them unhappy. They're making atmosphere for them to be in despair, like all the time. And so the marriage hearse part, this is an oxymoron. And the expansion of it, or the explanation of it, I would give, is that the only liberation that you get is when you die. And that is something that might be seen as a good thing in this poem for all the people, as they would rather die and get liberation at death instead of living this horrible life full of despair and sorrow in this city. So that is what I would explain, or how I would explain the last sentence. I would split it into two parts and explain it separately. And these are quite key points and key quotes, because they are literally explaining, or the examples of Blake putting his views into action in his poem. So he's looking at how there's so much corruption, how there's so much despair in London, that the only liberation you get is when you die. And this semantic field of disease and illness. And that may come from the despair and the sorrow and all the imprisonment and brainwash that the people are suffering from. So that was London, the analysis of London, written by William Blake. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Thank you very, very much for watching.